Good morning, dear students, or whatever time you're watching this video. My name is Blessing, and today we would be discussing the second topic in cognitive psychology. In the last class, we talked about what cognitive psychology is, its scopes, its historical background, key milestones, and the importance of cognitive psychology even in other fields. Today, we would be talking about key concepts in cognitive psychology. We will discuss the information processing model and memory. We'll be looking at the types and processes of memory. Moving on. What is the information processing model? The information processing model, also known as IPM for short, is central to cognitive psychology and represents a framework for understanding how human beings process information. It compares the human information processing to that of a computer. The computer, like brains, receives, analyzes, and determines how the information will be stored. Similarly, human brain receives, interprets, and uses information in stages which correspond to different steps in the information processing systems in computing. In the last class, I made reference to the IPM as one of the key milestones in the historical development of cognitive psychology. It came about around the 1950s, from the 1950s to the 1960s, and it likens the human mind or the human brain to a computer. It believes that just as a computer can process input, the human brain can process information and produce a response or behavior. The human brain is not a simply passive information processor. Human brains were not born with data, algorithms, and decoders. Rather, they were born with senses, reflexes, emotions, and the ability to learn and change over time. John Locke believes that every human is born with a blank slate. This means that we are not born with knowledge. We are not born with innate knowledge. It is while we grow that we begin to make meaning of things in our environment. We begin to learn and unlearn and relearn. This particular statement means that we are not born with information at all. We are not born with algorithms. We were not born to understand math. We were not even born with the English language. Rather, we were born with our senses, our reflexes, our emotions, our ability to learn and change over time. And so that is why when a child is born, they don't really speak like an adult or someone who was born 1 year after would speak. It is as time goes on that we learn, that he or she learns languages and makes meaning of the environment. This uniqueness has led to the development of models that explain how human beings process information. Basically, there are 4 common cognitive processes. They are detecting, understanding information, selecting response, and executing the selected response. What is detecting is how we recognize information. It has to do with how we recognize or see the information, the stimuli that the environment gives us. When you detect or recognize the information, you make meaning of it, you understand it. This is when perception comes in. Perception has to do with how you organize and interpret the information or stimuli we get from the environment. After understanding the information, then we select the response we give. The brain, after getting information, selects the most suitable response for that information. And then, after selecting the response, we execute the selected response. Several models exist to explain the information processing, but basically they include the same essential parts. There are other models that helps to explain how the human brain processes processes information, but all these models always make reference to these parts, which are sensation and perception, memory and cognition. Sensation has to do with becoming aware of the information around you. It is when you become aware, it is when you recognize the information, that the necessary or corresponding sense organ is stimulated. Sensation has to do with the awareness of the information, the awareness of the stimuli, which in turn results to the stimulation of a sense organ. Perception, like I said before, is the organization and interpretation of sensation. It is how you perceive the information that you get, how you interpret and how you're able to organize that particular stimuli. Then the next is memory. Memory has to do with how we encode, store, and retrieve information. And as we move on, I'm going to explain what the memory is. And the last is cognition. We talked about cognition in the last class. It has to do with attention. It has to do with, I mentioned some scopes: attention, problem solving, and decision making, and the others. This is a diagram showing what the information processing model is all about. We can see that the first is the environmental input, the information you get from the environment, the stimuli, after which it moves to the sensory input. The sensory inputs, these are our sense organs: the eyes, the sound, the eyes, the nose, the ears. A particular sense organ is stimulated when it is the most suitable sense organ for the information that we get. After which it moves to the sensory memory. That is the first component of the memory. And information that gets to the sensory memory can be forgotten. If it's not forgotten, that is where attention comes in. The reason why we do not forget a particular information and it moves to the short-term memory is because we gave attention to it. For example, I gave an example in the last class. I talked about someone who went to the market, and despite the noise they hear around them, they are still able to focus on the particular person attending to them. That is where attention comes in. And if you do not pay attention to a particular information, there's every possibility that you're going to forget. When we pay attention, such information is moved to the short-term memory. Even the information that gets to the short-term memory can be forgotten, and it can be forgotten through decay or displacement. For information not to be forgotten, we have to ensure maintenance. Maintenance could be rehearsal, it could be the use of mnemonics and other methods to ensure that the information is moved to the long-term memory. For information to move to the long-term memory, there has to be a conscious activity, a conscious rehearsal, so that the information is not forgotten. And even at the long-term memory, there could be a situation where a particular information can be forgotten. It could be due to interference or retrieval failure. There are some particular diseases or sicknesses that could lead to an information that could lead to information loss. These parts or these components of the memory are very important because each and every one of them play a very crucial role when it comes to information processing, when it comes to how we encode, store, and retrieve information. The IPM assumes that through maturation, one develops greater abilities to attend to stimulus, recognize patterns, encode, and retrieve information. Therefore, over long spans of time, individuals process information with greater efficiency. So, like I said before, as we grow, we begin to make meaning of the information we get around us. So the IPM assumes that as an individual develops and grows, one is able to process information better. One is able to make meaning of the stimulus they get from the environment. One is able to process information. One is able to store information, and one is able to retrieve information better. Over time, individuals experience more information, associations, and ways to categorize the input. The process may seem passive, but the model assumes that input from the environment is actively transformed and rehearsed to become a part of the long-term memory. For environmental information to become a part of the long-term memory, one must attend to, rehearse, and make sense of the stimuli. I mentioned this before, that for an information to be passed to the long-term memory and stored, there has to be a conscious engagement. There has to be conscious rehearsal. There has to be conscious attention for you to be able to remember that particular information for a longer period of time. Now let's discuss the memory. The memory is a fundamental cognitive process that allows individuals to encode, store, and retrieve information. It is essential for learning and plays a crucial role in everyday functioning, enabling us to recall past experiences, recognize people and places, and apply knowledge to new situations. The memory is a cognitive process that helps us to encode, store, and retrieve information when needed. It is very important when it comes to learning, and it plays a crucial role in our everyday activities. It would be very disastrous if after getting a particular information, you are unable to remember after 2 to 5 seconds. So the memory is very, very important. It allows us to recall all that we have heard. For example, as a student in a lecture or in a classroom, when you pay close attention, rapt attention to what the teacher or lecturer is teaching, the memory helps such information to stay, so that when you are going back to your notes, you are able to recollect, oh, this lecturer said so thing, and it aids better understanding. There are key components of memory. The first is encoding, the second is storage, and the third is retrieval. Encoding is the first step in the memory process. This is where information is transformed into a format that can be stored in the brain. It occurs through various means. It could be through visuals, that's seeing images. It could be acoustic, hearing sounds, and it could be semantic, that is making meaning. For example, when learning a new language, one might encode new vocabulary by associating it with images or sounds. The encoding is the very first step in the memory process, and it is where information is transformed into a particular format that can be stored in the brain. And it occurs in several ways. And encoding also has to do with the sense organs. You use your eyes to see, you use your ears to hear. So visuals has to do with seeing images, and these images are transformed into formats that can be stored in the brain. The second is storage. After information has been encoded, it is stored in the brain for later use. Memory can be categorized into different types based on duration and capacity. So, like I said before, when we get an information from the environment, it depends on different types of memory for that particular information to be stored for later use. The first is the sensory memory. This type holds a brief impression of sensory information, from milliseconds to a few seconds. This doesn't last long at all. This is type of memory, like I said in the last slide, when we talked about the diagram, the sensory memory is the very first type of memory, and it is connected directly to the sensory input. So immediately you get information and it is encoded, it moves to the sensory memory, and it lasts there only for a very, very few seconds. The next is the short-term memory. The short-term memory is also known as the working memory. It holds limited amounts of information, typically around 7 plus or minus 2 items. This means it holds around 5 to 9 items at a time for a short duration, about 20 to 30 seconds. It is actively used in tasks like problem solving or following instructions. The long-term memory. This can store a vast amount of information for extended periods, ranging from hours to a lifetime. Long-term memory is further divided into declarative memory, which includes episodic or personal experiences, and semantic memory, which deals with general knowledge, and the non-declarative memory, which is also known as the implicit memory, which includes skills and procedures. The long-term memory is the last part of the memory, and this is where information can be stored over a long period of time. It can be stored ranging from hours to a lifetime, and it is further divided into the declarative memory, which has to do with personal experiences, the semantic memory, which has to do with general knowledge, and the implicit memory, which includes skills and procedures. The last key component of the memory is retrieval. This is the process of assessing and bringing stored information back into consciousness. Retrieval can be prompted by cues and can vary in effectiveness. Sometimes people successfully recall information, while other times they may struggle to retrieve it, and this is known as tip of the tongue phenomenon. Retrieval has to do with how we are able to assess and bring back into remembrance a particular information when we need it. And it can be prompted by cues. Cues are devices we can use to remember certain information. Remember I talked about mnemonics, using the first letter of a particular concept to remember that particular information. And it can vary in effectiveness. Some people are able to recall information successfully, while others may struggle to retrieve it. And this is known as tip of the tongue phenomenon. Types of memory. The first is the declarative memory. This involves memories that can be consciously recalled, such as facts and events. It includes the episodic memory, memories of a specific event or experiences, such as a birthday party or a vacation. Or the semantic memory. The semantic memory it has to do with general knowledge and facts about the world, such as knowing that Paris is the capital of France. The episodic memory and the semantic memory are all under the declarative memory. It has to do with it can be consciously recalled, and there are memories that could be events or facts, and it's divided into two. The episodic memory, this has to do with events or experiences. The semantic memory has to do with general knowledge and facts around the world. The second type of memory is the non-declarative memory. This includes skills and behaviors that are performed without conscious awareness, such as riding a bicycle or playing a musical instrument. It involves procedural memory and conditioned responses. How to improve memory? There are several ways to improve how we are able to store and retrieve information whenever we need it. The first is repetition and practice. This is reviewing information multiple times to enhance encoding and retrieval. Remember, practice makes perfect. When you repeat a particular information or practice a particular skill, it helps you to recall or remember whatever you've learned, and it will be easier for you to retrieve when you need it. Mnemonic devices. This include using patterns, acronyms, or visual imagery to aid memory. I've been using mnemonics as an example. It involves using acronyms or particular patterns or visual imagery to aid memory. A lot of people use acronyms more. We have, while in primary or secondary school, the planets, we use the first letters of the planets to make the first letters of the types of the planets to make. We used the first letters of the 9 planets to make a mnemonic device to help us remember the 9 planets very easily. The next is chunking. This is breaking down large amounts of information into smaller or manageable units for remembrance. We often use this a lot when reading or when studying. You could decide that, okay, I'll read these first 4 pages, summarize, and move to the next. That is known as chunking, breaking down information, breaking down the information we are trying to store into smaller units or smaller parts to aid better storage and retrieval. The next is elaborate rehearsal. This involves connecting new information to existing knowledge to enhance retention. Now we've come to the end of today's class. We are going to do a quick revision of what we've discussed today before we answer the questions. Today we talked about the information processing model, how it's very essential in cognitive psychology, and how it likens the human brain to a computer. We talked about the fact that as humans we are not born with knowledge, but as time goes on we begin to make meaning of the information we get from the environment. We begin to learn, we begin to relearn, we begin to unlearn, and this process continues even as we grow. We talked about the four common cognitive processes: detecting, understanding information, selecting response, and then executing the selected response. We talked about the basic parts that are involved in any model you could find on information processing. There are several models that explain what information processing is about, but every one of them always talk about these these four things, which are sensation and perception, memory, and cognition. We talked about we talked about the information processing model, and we explained this particular diagram: how we get information from the environment, how we encode it, how it moves to the sensory memory, and how attention helps us to move to the short-term memory, and how maintenance, rehearsal, use of mnemonic devices, use of repetition or rehearsal can help us store that particular information. We talked about the memory and the key components of the memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. We explained them. We said encoding has to do with transforming information into a format that can be stored easily in the brain. We said storage has to do with how we are able to keep a particular information in the brain for later use. And we said the memory can be categorized into different types based on duration and capacity. Please take note of this. Memory can be categorized into different parts or different types based on duration and capacity. Based on duration, we have the sensory memory, we have the short-term memory, also known as the working memory, and we have the long-term memory. We also talked about retrieval, and this is the process that has to do with how we retrieve or how we access the information that has been stored when we need it. We talked about the types of memory when it has to do with capacity: the declarative memory, which consists of the episodic memory and the semantic memory, and the non-declarative memory, which has to do with skills and behaviors that are performed without conscious awareness. We talked about how we can improve memory, how we can improve our storage, how we store information, and how we can retrieve it whenever we need it. The first we talked about was repetition and practice. We talked about mnemonic devices. We talked about chunking, and we talked about elaborative rehearsal. Let's move to the quiz. The first question is, what does the IPM stand for? What does the IPM stand for? The IPM stands for Information Processing Model. Please do not forget. The short-term memory is also known as the working memory. If you come across this question, please remember that the short-term memory is also known as the working memory. What is the capacity of the short-term memory? The short-term memory is able to hold 5 to 9 informations. 5 to 9 informations from ranging from 20 to 30 seconds. That is the capacity of the short-term memory. What does retrieval mean? Retrieval is the process that deals with how we're able to access or bring back to remembrance information when we need it at a particular time. And the last question is a quite personal one. Which method of memory improvement do you find most effective? For me, I find the use of mnemonic devices very effective because I use that a lot. Using acronyms to remember certain information, especially when I'm studying. I also make use of chunking, breaking large information into smaller manageable units to aid easier rehearsal and storage. We've come to the end of today's class. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you would remember all that we talked about today. And even if there are things you've forgotten, maybe there are things that wasn't passed on to the short-term memory, or there are things that you don't remember, you can always go back. Remember, repetition is one of the ways to improve memory. So you can always go back and listen to what we discussed again to aid storage and remembrance. Thank you very much, and see you in the next class.